me ask a related question. Why is Paris important in the way that Easton talked about it? If you are from China, if you're from Los Angeles, if you're from someplace that is, Paris is historically important, but in terms of this course, in terms of bigger concepts that people are thinking about. Yes?
I don't know if I have an answer exactly to that question, but I mean, both historically, she was talking about Paris as like this birthplace of Bohemia, and kind of how you can see those influences kind of, in many other cities across the world today. And then I think also just like, she was talking, I can't remember exactly, but like a little bit about how Paris, they connect their cultural policy with, thinking about walking in the city and public transportation, and then other cities kind of pick up on what they're doing and are influenced by their cultural policy at least.
Say something else. Okay, seems to be working. I'm using an app for the first time from Christina that's supposed to go immediately streaming to YouTube. Let's hope it works. Okay. Okay. Paris is the birthplace of Bohemia. Yes, excellent. And one central point. Second and related, how is Paris different from London or Berlin at roughly the same period, or later on New York or most other cities of the world? That is, if we think of the big concepts moving from feudalism, the traditional societies, clientelism of the farmer, peasant working for the master, then what happened? What did people talk about as one of the biggest historical changes at the end of the 18th, early the 19th century, especially in England? The Industrial Revolution. Industry was seen as transforming agriculture, which had been there for thousands of years. And England was widely applauded as the leading country to first industrialize and to move toward this new world order. Okay. What did they do in Paris about this? Did they have a lot of industry? London, Manchester, Birmingham, smaller cities in the English countryside. Smoke, new factories. The French built a couple of factories nearby Paris, and the French immediately said, smoke! This is terrible. We do not want smoke on this beautiful city. Beauty, style, elegance, those things at the court, those values of artistic sensitivity that had been honed around poetry and conversation, trumped industrialization, and the French said, no industry, period. Were they killing themselves economically? Many people said, yes, this will be the death of France. This will be the end of French, economic activity. But what happened? Paris kept growing economically through this was around 1800. For the next 2 centuries until today, Paris has been doing pretty well economically, but not following the same route as England, Germany, the US, and most other countries of the world, like China more recently, where industry was seen as essential, especially if you had been a theory like Marx, who said the stages, the scientific history of society says you must go from feudalism to capitalism with industry and then on to socialism, and then on to communism. Okay, if you believe that, then you must industrialize if you are to modernize. And so in the Soviet Union, and Eastern Europe, and China, there's a huge effort to build up capital investment, to build the economy, because that was seen as critical. But how do you build the economy? In most of those countries, it was industry. What did Paris do that was so different, and why is that important today for us now? Answer one, industry is in huge decline today in most of the world. But let's be careful. Industry is going down in the sense of industrial jobs. But in terms of industrial products, like automobiles, computers, shirts, clothes, industry is booming. We still have stuff. We still have the products of industry. But how can we reconcile these two things? That is, by contrast, we have other kinds of jobs, services is going up. And in certain subfields, like arts, are going up faster. What's the point here? Why are industrial jobs going down when products are going up? Yes?
Because we're becoming more efficient? We're just becoming more efficient?
Yeah, we're more efficient through things like technology, computers. Productivity is going up and up and up. That is, we don't have to have men with heavy backs digging ditches. We have tractors, we have trucks, we have bulldozers, we have heavy-duty equipment. Automobiles are produced by a small number of people in very, very smart machines. Okay, and this is happening worldwide. Okay, so industrial jobs are going down because fewer people are doing the heavy, heavy work because they're replaced by machinery, but the products are still there. Okay, did the French say, let's invent the computer or let's have more efficient industry in 1800? No. So we today are in this situation, and that we got industrial products going well. But we are moving toward, in terms of the people, we're moving toward a post-industrial society, and that the percentage of the labor force is getting smaller and smaller that works in industry. Instead, we have more people working in services, in creative fields like the arts, like like web design, like all kinds of things. The knowledge economy is a new label. Creative cities, we talked about the innovation. This is a thrust from Schumpeter, Jane Jacobs. Innovation, new ideas, including high tech, but also the arts. These are critical drivers of the new economy in ways that the old standard low productivity workforce of the industrial past is further and further in distant history. Okay. So why do we? So we need to look at both, because we're experiencing as consumers, we're getting computers, we're getting the products of industry, even if it's done more efficiently. However, from the standpoint of the political system or the drivers of social dynamics, if we think in Marxist terms, we need to have a proletarian-led revolution. Okay. Did they have a proletarian-led revolution in Russia or in China? No. These were agricultural societies, so they were ahead of Marx in terms of those scientific historical stages. So many people, the Mensheviks said, wait. Lenin said, no, seize the moment. There's such disarray in Russia with World War I. Now we must seize power and have a revolution, even if we know we do not have industry. We're a pre-industrial society, but we will go ahead. The Chinese were similar in that respect. Mao. Mao was the leader of agriculture. The urban leaders of the Communist Party were killed. They were killed in the war by British and others in the 1930s. And so because the urban leadership of the Communist Party was killed off, Mao and the rural section led the Communist Party into leadership after World War I. So, but in a sense, that's not what Marx had said. Marx said, wait, and then you don't need necessarily to have violence. Okay, so Lenin and Mao were politically very successful, but they were very tough and they killed a lot of people in the process. But the point is, these were critical for explaining how history took place, and they involved conflict among different social and economic groups, which is exactly what Marx talked about. But I'm only referring to this in a sense to say we are now in a period post-industrial, and we need to think in very new terms. And we can learn from Paris, because Paris said we can skip industry. We can get by, and how could they possibly do this? Then and now. What's the big driver of the Paris economy?
Tourism.
Tourism. What's the number one industry in the world today? Tourism. Either number one or number three based on how you do the accounting numbers. Tourists are consumers. They're not there to shop, to manufacture. They're there more. I mean, you may go to a convention, to a business convention, a political convention, but then if you stay on as a tourist with your family or friends, you walk around, you go to the museums, you do shopping, you go to restaurants. That's the tourism part. And Paris has done that, as have places like the Italian cities, the Spanish cities, the Greek cities that have beaches, wine, pasta, good weather. If you're from Northern Europe, you like to go where the sun is. And not only Paris, but Spain, Italy, Greece have been doing this so that in the sense that the tourism is the number one driver of the whole national economy for a long time. There are lessons here for the Chinese, for the Americans, for the Scandinavians, that you can be green, you can be sensitive to the environment, you can build a new infrastructure of how things work, and you don't have to follow exactly the same stages as everybody. That is, maybe they're not such iron laws of historical stages as the simple stage theory would have. I mean, there are multiple stage theories, not just Marx, but Marx is the most famous one. Okay, so with the decline of these industrial jobs, we have Paris as a model. Who then has studied this more carefully than maybe anybody? Not many people, but one of the most famous was a guy who went to Paris. He was considered by some the most brilliant intellectual of Weimar Germany, and he was a Marxist. And he was enough of a Marxist that he wanted to have the leading Marxists in Germany, Adorno and Horkheimer, supervise his PhD. They refused. They said, you're not really you're not close enough to the classic Marxist position. And maybe, so Benjamin went elsewhere. So he was always close. I mean, he was largely Marxist, but he didn't have necessarily. Okay, so that clearly, not making the point, there are many types of Marxism then and today, ranging from the different parties to different regions and then how political leaders interpret Marx. Okay, so Benjamin was Marxist from beginning to end in much of what he wrote. At the same time, he was looking for ways of making the analysis more subtle and more specifically historically informed, more historically correct in his terms, to try to see how, and his big question, which he went here to Paris to study, was how could Paris succeed economically when it didn't have industry, It wasn't doing the normal Marxist things. And how could this be lessons for more general analysis, as he was thinking more, he was a theorist. He also wrote a book on Moscow. He went to Moscow under Stalin. So it was Lenin, I guess mostly Stalin. And he wrote a book, and he wrote about Berlin. So I mean, initially he was mostly working on Germany, but he was cosmopolitan enough, and he was trying to generalize that he went to Moscow to see how does socialism work in practice. Then he went to Paris and said, you know, how can the economy work here in practice, and join this with the lessons of Marxist theory that we have in Germany, with the specifics in Moscow and what's going on in Paris. In that sense, it's a little bit like Max Weber's small and comparative studies, not building a very big abstract theory. He did a little bit of that, but most of what he did was quite historically, very specifically informed. At the same time, he was in ways that we now talk about as he was sensitive, let's say, to the issues of political correctness. That is, he didn't want to abandon his Marxist friends and intellectual followers. He had thousands of people who were reading him. He was very famous in his lifetime. He was not a professor. He wrote for newspapers. He had to support himself by writing for the general public, and writing for a general public with a leftist orientation. I mean, he didn't want to alienate too many readers. He published in different places, so he could write specialist essays on some things, but other things were okay. So he wanted to maintain his Marxist credentials, but at the same time, he was studying France. What were some of his main sources? That is, did he go to meetings? Did he work in archives? Did he write novels? What were his sources? If you've looked at his essay, and it's part of the essay is the introductory summary to a book which is published as a book. It was never finished as a book while he was alive. It was assembled afterward. So these were essays and notes of a fat book published by Harvard University Press, a series of books like this called The Arcade Project. Okay. The essay we've read is a summary of the fat book. It has maybe 20 or so different ideas. Each of these ideas is elaborated in more detail in the rest of the book. So, and he writes in a humorous, ironic, nonchalant sort of way that looks easy and fun, but at the same time, it's complicated. And if they're terms, I mean, especially if you're not a native English speaker, there may be many, and he wrote in German initially, so this is a translation from the German. So if there's a term that seems unusual to you, look it up on the web, and you can look in the rest of the book. Many are specific historical French terms, but I'm going to introduce some of the most conceptually central, but I won't try to fill in all of the history. Okay. My first question was, what were his sources? Main sources. I mean, he used lots of things. He read the newspapers. He walked around, so forth. But his main source, one main source was the leading French intellectual of the time, who happened to be a poet and an essayist and an editor of a journal called Wagner Studies. Richard Wagner, the musician. Okay. Somebody ought to tell me if we're putting this on the board for an E. I think there's an E in there. B-E-A-U. Is that right? We need an E. I failed spelling when I was in grammar school.
B-A-U-D-E-L-A-I-R-E. So you-
I passed spelling today. Thank you. Okay. All right. What's the point of this? Baudelaire was, Benjamin and Baudelaire were brilliant, but they were not social scientists. They were not engineers. They were not, there are many ways that he wasn't an economist. He was a literary critic, but he went to work or tried to work with Adorno and Horkheimer, who were sociologists, philosophers, overlapping with economic history, and Adorno was also a musical composer. So they were broad gauge people, but literature and the arts were central to all of their thinking. And I think, I don't know, I haven't seen this, but I would bet that Benjamin was brilliant enough that he sensed that Baudelaire was not only a man of the arts, but he was very smart, but he was also socially perceptive. He lived a very solitary life, was not married, he had very little contact with other people. His closest personal relationship was with a woman who was a street prostitute. And so she would talk to him and tell him anecdotes, and much of his poetry and his essays are about street life and what happens in the street, and has a very, let's say, critical, negative style. His most famous book is called The Flowers of Evil, Les Fleurs du Mal. And he has images of beauty, sunsets, streets, images of views of nice buildings, the Seine River, much of it Parisian. But evil and how evil fits in with beauty was, in a sense, a recurrent theme. And this also, this appealed then and today to a sort of youthful, somewhat revolutionary sensitivity of many younger people, younger readers in France and around the world. He also has case studies of others, including surrealists like Salvador Dali and others. What was the style of the surrealists? Anybody ever see a movie or an art exhibition or a painting by Dali? Yeah.
That's taking real things and changing how they behave in a way that's unexpected and challenges
Just a little bit louder. Just taking real things and making them unexpected, but in what sort of way?
That's meant to make us uncomfortable.
Okay,
And challenge
to
us.
try to make you uncomfortable. What do you want to elaborate? Yes, in the back.
To disassociate from reality.
Yes, but there are many ways to do that. So, how about, say, I was going to refer to Picasso's Guernica painting, but he was not really a surrealist. But the point is that they were they had a sort of social program as well as an artistic program. And socially, they were revolutionaries. They were against the establishment. They were against the bourgeoisie. They were against elegant Paris. But at the same time, they weren't really poor and uneducated. They were themselves of bourgeois background. They were cultured. They were sophisticated. So they wanted to do this in a way that would shock. And this we see in others. We see it in Bertolt Brecht. We see it in the German expressionists of the time. That is, the idea was to use art to shock and to question your social backgrounds, and then to say, should we have I mean, that's the sort of Marxist interpretation, which is explicit in a number of these people. Okay, so and there were many others as well in France and Germany in these years. There were all kinds of in Italy, little splinter groups there were often artists, some were architects, they had political programs, they had quasi-religious, cult-like activities. There's a great book that I reviewed in the American Journal of Sociology a couple of months ago on Durkheim and the arts, where these people are dug out from the 1930s, especially. Where they were, okay, so I'm making the point that this milieu of dynamic change had many elements closer to what we are talking about today than many saw at the time. That is, if you just think of Paris as a less industrialized city, therefore it must be out of date, or carry over the past, you miss the point. That is, the innovators, that is, if we flash forward to the first sections of this course when we said, what are the drivers of cities? One I mentioned was innovation. Another was the arts and consumption. Paris was doing this through the 19th and into the 20th century. That's a big point. So I mentioned tourism. We mentioned the arts. We're mentioning consumption. So how could this work just in simple economic terms? How could Paris be vital and economically successful through the 19th century if they didn't build any factories? Yeah.
Isn't it the ironwork that emerges and you're kind of building a large city that other people come into? Especially.
You say the ironwork?
Yeah.
In what sense?
No, from the reading. I didn't completely understand that.
From Benjamin?
Yeah.
The main, and I'm trying to think of the ironwork you're referring to. I mean, he talks about the Eiffel Tower. You mean that? Did you just?
No, I think he was just talking about like the importance of larger cities that attract people from surrounding areas to shop, namely for textiles.
Okay, here we go. No, shop for textiles and more. Okay, that's the beginning of the critical answer. That is, in a sense, yeah. Over here, comment.
Wasn't Paris also like very agricultural once you get outside the city?
Yes, I mean outside, but in the city itself it was not. I mean, agriculture was not the main industry of the city of Paris.
Right. Cool.
So what was?
Was it the arts?
I'd say maybe we could call it entertainment and things that, I mean, that's what, if you go, knock on the front door of City Hall today in Chicago, what do they tell you is the main economic base of the city of Chicago today? Entertainment. They could have said that in Paris in 1820, 1840, 1880, 1920. Yeah.
So there were people like passing through from Europe, or like how did they get enough travel? People go.
Yeah. Okay, go ahead.
Didn't it also become like an intellectual base for people all over Europe to come and practice art and things? So it wasn't necessarily tourists, but people would settle there specifically to meet other artists.
Yes, major point. So some people may have been there for a few days, a business convention or just a grand tour for pleasure, but others were there for 2 years, 5 years. Many people, many emigre Russians, many Italians and Spaniards, such as, especially when there were strong, let's call them authoritarian political regimes. Under the Tsar of Russia later on under Franco in Spain, or under Mussolini in Italy. I mean, there were many people who left those countries, and the artists, the intellectuals, the writers often like to go to Paris. So they might stay there 5, 10, 20 years. Picasso basically left Spain permanently very early in the 20th century. And so once you have a Picasso there and other people like Picasso sort of showing the way, then other younger Spanish or Italian or Greek artists would come as well. So yes, in that sense, it's an almost, in these terms, you're pointing your finger at some critical drivers of post-industrial societies that we have in Chicago or emerging in Tokyo or other places today. Yeah.
Wasn't a lot of this also because of the Haussmann renovations?
Yes. Okay, tell us about that.
It was like mid-1800s. Old Paris looks a lot more like some of the cities around it, and instead they wanted to bring in more modern taste. So a lot of modern Paris is because of this. You have very large boulevards, a lot of retail spaces with arcade spaces on the ground level, which is why it's kind of called the Arcades Project. But it basically just transformed Paris from something that had, you know, little alleys and looked a lot more like traditional European cities into something that's more typically modern, or what we see
And
today.
see, careful. Was the goal and the product typically modern, or was it more beautiful than any other city in the world, at least in their aspiration?
It was beautiful, and it was also more clean.
Okay, yes. Modern in the sense that it didn't have little, narrow, small streets with many beggars who might also become politically revolutionary. Instead, they had open boulevards, and one interpretation of many, of left and right and whatever, was this could permit the army to go down the boulevards with their troops and their horses and suppress any political revolution. And there were many political quasi-revolutions in Paris over the whole 19th century. That is, there were continual, massive political changes. They went from the monarchy, 1789, the guillotine, they killed off the monarchy. They had Napoleon as an emperor. They then had more, ostensibly democratic elections. Then you had Louis Philippe. That is, you had a series of kings and emperors and all kinds of, and so there was no single consistent group. And then around all of these, you had very small followings of wild revolutionary political parties and groups that were potentially growing that way. So in that sense, there was lots of political turbulence, and and in the sense that the army might be called in. Okay. So that's the Haussmann piece. He was Baron administrator of the city of Paris region, and he was very tough, but they did massive things in terms of, tearing down all kinds of buildings, driving out all kinds of residents, and so, and specifically, the poorest people, the beggars, poor people who went around and so forth, asking for money, unemployed, were basically driven out of central Paris to the north, or to the north and northeast a bit, and those regions today are called the Red Belt because they became the politically left. I mean, especially the Communist Party had stronger voting in those areas where they had more blue collar workers, and the mayors of those cities. These were separate communes of the greater region called Greater Paris. So you have downtown Paris, but you then have these external areas, towns. Okay, Haussmann is a good piece. Intellectuals are a good point. Tourism is important. You also had people who built houses there that they would talk about, such as the English or the Germans, industrialists or others, who made lots of money with their industries in foreign countries where the dirt was, the smoke, you know, in London or Birmingham or whatever. But many of them would like to go to Paris, and some of them who were particularly affluent would have a house, a big house in Paris, and they might go there once a month or every couple of months and spend money and entertain and have a good time. So they'd earn their money in a dirty Birmingham, but they'd spend their money in Paris. Okay, so that was a critical driver through the 19th century of some of these. That's part of the idea that, in a sense, it took the money from the industrializing rest of the world, or the politically suppressed rest of the world, like Russia, Italy, and so forth, and it had either high-level aristocrats or large landowners, capitalists, and so forth, who would bring the money to that is, in the aristocratic style, of course, work was not sacred the way it was under Calvinism, in the sense that, you know, with the Puritan Protestant Revolution combined with, let's say, the way this was interpreted in Russia and in China, that is, with Lenin, with Stalin, with Mao, the goal of communist society was to build the new economy, the new society, and it meant work, 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 work through production. Not to spend your money, you know, buying pretty things, which would hold back, and if industry was seen as a driver. So you had these big factories, not only in Russia, China, all of Eastern Europe. These were central, and they were state constructed for steel, for automobiles, and so forth. These were seen as the driver of the economy, and we still have debates going on today. I mean, how much do we need strong state control versus a more competitive market system? And so China, in the last 20, 30 years, has become more internally market competitive within the economy, even if the political system has remained more hierarchical. But the political system is opening up as well. So the question is, how do these pieces fit together, and what are some of their done? But one big theme clearly is the consumer-driven economy, and so this is openly discussed explicitly in China today, and it's more important for China in the sense, because these are public decisions. These are not just individuals doing things on their own, the way it happened more in say in England or the U.S. Instead, this is central policy, so you can have the Communist Party explicitly discussing what will our 5-year plan be, how will we plan for this. So that process tends to make these things more explicit and explicitly public policy decisions. Okay, we're putting the pieces together not only at Paris, but of theorizing about how can cities and economies and political systems change. And then we're using these examples to generalize to China, to others at the present time, including the U.S. or London at the present time, which have gone through. That I guess one more quick point I'll make about China is that China, or let's say Korea, Korea have been very, very fast, Taiwan as well, very fast in their speed of their economic growth. Korea was at the same level of the economy as Africa in 1945, roughly. So Korea went from being at the same level of Africa to becoming, you know, a quite advanced economic economy today. So very fast. So when this happens within just, you know, one generation, one or two generations, I mean, people see these things happening so fast that there's more explicit discussion about what should we do and why. And one of the big themes is the consumer. So where and how does the consumer come in? All right, we had the point raised about iron and about tourism and the arcades, how do these fit together with the consumer? In Benjamin's historical and then theoretical account. What were the arcades? That's the title of the book. The Arcade Project. What's the meaning of that? Okay, in 1820, you had lots of little shops along one side of the street, then the other side of the street. In Paris, from about, let's say, October to May, the weather's about like this today. It rains, it drizzles, it's gray, and you don't want to go out and walk around. You don't want to shop. Yes?
So didn't they basically put like glass roofs over?
Just a little louder?
Oh, they basically put like glass roofs over so that people can shop during like the rainy season, and that like basically led to what we now see as like department stores.
Yes. So they created arcade by putting glass tops held together with bits of iron or steel over the top. So these little individual shops were covered in a collective way that made shopping possible. So you could walk along and look in the windows in 1820, 1830. Okay, what happened? So the next big historical jump in this regard was what happened around 1890 in Paris and in London and in Chicago and New York. They created a new institution that built on this, which was called what? Department stores. So you would take the same idea as the arcade, but you'd put it in one company's building or a series of buildings. And you might have sections in it for women's dresses, men's ties, shoes, and so forth. But it would be one big building by one company. And maybe they could do things like sell at lower prices because they could buy in larger quantity, and you could also see things more inside. And in ways, okay, so then who were the people and what was the change as we went from arcade to department stores? Let's say 1820 to 1890. What was the social transformation? So let's go back to 1820. What was the label that was used by the French and that Benjamin talks about to refer to this person who's shopping and looking at the windows and wandering through the streets? What's the French term for that? Don't need much, but this, I said we're not going to introduce many fancy concepts. This is one you should take away. The only one you really need.
I don't know how to pronounce it, but it's Flaner.
You left your spelling is as good as mine.
Yes, EUR.
Okay, Flaneur. Le flâneur. Okay, this is the person who wanders through the streets, walking slowly and shopping, and then later on the grand boulevards. When the weather was okay, you could walk on the grand boulevards and shop as well. And in the Impressionists or other paintings, this would be a gentleman with a top hat, elegant black outfit, and a pretty lady on his arm as they would both be shopping. Maybe a ballerina in some cases. The ballet was seen where many pretty ladies were. So, okay. So the flâneur, ideally, really, the ideal typical flâneur was a man. He may have had a lady with him, but he was seen as the agent, and he was seen as the person who was not only shopping, that's one piece, but second, the flâneur was also a thinker. He was a quasi-intellectual. He was reflecting on what was going on around him, and he was saying, you know, what if we tore down those shops and we put in a boulevard? Wouldn't Paris be nicer? That is, there was intellectual reflection, and these ideas were then codified in part by Honoré de Balzac, the novelist, B-A-L-Z-A-C, okay, who then in turn influenced Baudelaire. And they both talked about street life, the flaneur, the consumer as an intellectual and a person who would read our poetry and read our novels. Why is this important for Marxist theory? Not just Marxist, let's say, for neoclassical economic theory. Alfred Marshall, Adam Smith, and what was, let me add one more, say the Chicago Federal Reserve. I went to a presentation they made on the Midwest region's economy maybe 20 years ago, 15 years ago. And they talked about, here are the numbers of products being produced in the factories, here are the number of jobs by industry, in industry and service and so forth, here are the number of, here's the income, that is, everything was production. They said nothing explicit about consumption. They didn't talk about shopping or department stores. They didn't mention conventions. They didn't discuss the consumer, restaurants, nightlife, retail, Northern Michigan Avenue. All of that was ignored in that is, at least, it may have been there implicit, but it wasn't broken out in a way. Everything was informed by the idea of production. So I went up to the guy who made the presentation. He was the director of research at the Chicago Federal Reserve, and I said, how about talking about consumption as well as production, because Chicago is now doing this with a vengeance. The mayor knows this. The mayor is talking about entertainment, about tourism. Why don't you try to bring the economists up to date with what's happening in the city? And he said, maybe we should. So he came to one of our meetings. He listened to 4 or 5 presentations by people working on this stuff. Then he invited me and Edward Glaser at Harvard, economist trained here, has been at Harvard for 15 years or so, to organize a session with about 80 economists who came from all over generally the Midwest, but anybody was invited. And by the end of the day, a third of them were ready to, I would say, just from the conversation, a third of the discussion was interested and trying to think about how to pursue explicitly incorporating consumption into the traditional production focus of most economic analysis. And so it's happening. And I would say among the social scientists, the economists are sometimes ahead of the political scientists and the sociologists and the anthropologists who still talk about capitalism as if it's production-driven rather than consumption-driven. It's both. You need to look at both. But if you leave out the consumption side, you leave out Paris, you leave out the flaneur. So the big conceptual point for social science and more general Marxist interpretation of these things, and this is part of why Benjamin had trouble with his Marxist credentials, was if you talk explicitly about the flaneur as a driver of the economy, and these arcades being covered over and looking at the clothes in the window, or going to a department store, and this matters because if the department store sells more, it orders more shirts, it orders more shoes,